Hey everyone, this is Patrick with the 307 RPG podcast, and I just want to take a moment and say thank you to all of our amazing patrons. It's because of you that we're able to do the things that we do. If you like our show and you want to support us, you can find us on patreon.com/theforgeherald. Thanks everyone. I hope you enjoy the show. Hello everybody, and welcome to the 307 RPG podcast. My name is Patrick, and tonight I am your host, as we have a very special guest on our show. He is a writer, he's a developer, and you probably know him best as a gentleman gamer. He is Matthew Dawkins. Matthew is joining us tonight to talk to us about the game Call of Cthulhu. Matthew, thank you so much for joining us today.
I'm very glad to be here.
So, like I was saying earlier, you have me at a disadvantage in that normally you and I know what we're going to be talking about. We kind of have an idea of how the conversation is going to go. This time, we're talking Call of Cthulhu, and you've been working on a source book that is as yet unnamed, unmentioned, and I don't know what to ask. So,
unnameable or unspeakable is actually a good way to refer to it, given the source material.
It really is.
I did check in with Chaosium before doing this interview to see how much I could discuss about that upcoming book, and the answer is very little. It is a book about the great old one, whose name begins with a big capital H, who shall not be named. Often likes to wear shades of yellow, and dwells in a place called Carcosa. As we know, time is a flat circle. Otherwise, the content of that book and when it will be released and everything is so far a mystery. It's fully written from my end. All 120,000 words or so were written by myself. It wasn't co-authored, and that was quite an undertaking. I can tell you that's the first time I've ever had to write a book anywhere close to that size by myself. But yeah, I'm really happy with it, and hopefully in the next few months more news will come out about it.
Well, we have a few things to cover tonight, and I'm really excited to hear more, well, what you can, and that may be all you can tell me, but I want to backtrack just a little bit, Matthew, because typically Nolan and I talk about Dungeons and Dragons or even Vampire the Masquerade or other World of Darkness games. Call of Cthulhu is a new one for us. And with so many people coming to role-playing games, specifically Dungeons and Dragons, because of Critical Role, I thought it'd be really probably well served our listeners if you just kind of went into what is Call of Cthulhu.
Okay, well, Call of Cthulhu, the original short story, was penned by an author by the name of H.P. Lovecraft. And the Lovecraftian elements of the Call of Cthulhu role-playing game are quite removed now from what the game itself is about. And Call of Cthulhu is at heart an investigation game. You play investigators from various walks of life, typically in the 1920s period. And you could be set anywhere around the world. There's lots of lovely source books set in all kinds of places. But these investigators will tend to be looking into something like someone has gone missing, or there's an unexplainable murder, or any kind of mystery that you might find from the kind of serial novellas or the like of the time. And they inevitably, during the course of this investigation, stumble upon matters esoteric and weird that they don't necessarily understand. And as they delve deeper and deeper into this mystery, they tend to lose their grip on reality. And in Call of Cthulhu, the primary mechanic, as it has always been, is sanity. You have your attributes, your skills, your even magic points if you want to risk losing sanity to learn spells. But as well as having hit points, you have sanity points. Sanity points essentially chart your mental degradation. And it doesn't go into such things as real-world mental illnesses. Your characters don't start developing things like depression or schizophrenia or become schizoid personality or anything like that. It's essentially your grip on reality, on being human, just erodes. Now, this, when it was introduced back in, I think, and I may get the year wrong, I think 1979 was the first edition of Call of Cthulhu, but I could be wrong. This idea of having a mechanic that wasn't just charting your health was quite revolutionary. And it has become a central concept of Call of Cthulhu ever since. That the old adage when running Call of Cthulhu is that your player characters will either end up dead by the end of the story or insane in a sanitarium. Now, I wouldn't say that has to be the case, and in fact, I would say that running Call of Cthulhu with that objective in mind every single time can come across as a bit lazy. It's kind of the staple of the Call of Cthulhu convention game. But I would say that the risk of sanity being as pressing, almost more so than the physical risk to your characters, really puts a different slant on how you approach a game of Call of Cthulhu as opposed to how you approach a game of Dungeons and Dragons, for instance. Because what I've found as a keeper, that's the GM in a Call of Cthulhu game, is players tend to be a hell of a lot more cautious in Call of Cthulhu than they are in any other role-playing game, because they want to find out the answer to the mystery, but they want to set up as many contingencies, fallbacks, essentially covers for their eyes, so that when they open the door and see the solution to the mystery on the other side, they don't just lose their minds and become vegetables. So people become quite cautious about their characters, their character actions. It's always an interesting game to observe, let alone run or play. To go further, Call of Cthulhu does have a setting. It has a raft of great old ones that are essentially like alien gods. They have no attachment really to humanity, and they very rarely take human form. The old stereotype is eyeballs and tentacles aplenty, really. They also have lots of weird and creepy monsters, deep ones, kind of amphibious or fishmen, to star spawn and the great race of Yith and the Hound of Tindalos. You have all these creatures that are so eldritch and different to what you might find in your staple fantasy role-playing games. So there's no orcs, no goblins, nothing like that. It's all entirely alien and weird. There's a lot of body horror as well as psychological horror. Creatures that are made up of tiny little fungus, just all coagulated together to become flying polyps, or things that are crawling mounds of tongues, or things that just defy physics and reality. So you might be facing up against what is, for intents and purposes, a split in mathematics hovering in the air. This thing does just not compute by looking at it, and by staring at it you start losing your mind. But the problem is, while it's there, it is eroding reality around it. So what are you going to do about it? So it's a very interesting game. It's one of the longest lasting tabletop role-playing games in terms of its age, and it's on its 7th edition. So yeah, it's definitely one of my favorites. Has been ever since the first time I played it.
I've only played Call of Cthulhu once, and this was back in, I want to say, 1997. A friend of ours really wanted us to play. I was into Vampire and Dungeons and Dragons at the time, and I, of course, jumped right into it. And I just remember the way we ended up solving the issue without going insane was we had to get basically a dump truck full of salt and dump it into this house to seal off whatever the creature was. And it was so unlike anything. Like, I was an investigator who was carrying a revolver, and it was useless. I was like,
yeah.
I thought that was fascinating.
It's a game where the most commonly used skills are library use and spot hidden, both of which are also skills that if you overuse them, you tend to discover things you really wish you hadn't. But yeah, combat skills like a handgun, or if you're just trying to strike something unarmed with a sort of hand-to-hand or close combat, what have you, it always seems like a good idea, because every other tabletop role-playing game has combat sort of ingrained into it. And there are rules for combat in Call of Cthulhu, and yes, you may come up against cultists who are all too human and as vulnerable as you. But if you're facing off against a moon beast that has tendrils for a face, and will quite happily swallow your head, punching it and indeed shooting it isn't going to achieve much.
No,
You
it's
always have
not.
to sort of think outside the box when playing Call of Cthulhu.
And I think that's one of the things that I love about the game is that you do have to. I mean, I could have very well just thrown the pistol at the creature and because that's how useless it was. And I like the fact that it causes you to think and try to find other ways to solve the issue. It's a fascinating game.
Definitely. And, I think, well, in fact, my experience, I can't speak for this in a kind of, I guess, global role players sense. My experience is that Call of Cthulhu was one of the first games to really appeal to non-males. Because it doesn't have that over focus. When you think of the original D&D, and you think of RuneQuest and the other real old school tabletop RPGs, they were so based around, I guess, the stereotypical male fantasy of running into battle and hitting things with your sword.
Yes.
And while there's definitely plenty of women who enjoy that kind of thing too, what Call of Cthulhu did was take away the necessity for you to have a brawny character with no intelligence, but the focus on social roleplay and investigation. And all of a sudden, it's not that appeals, I think, to women more. I think it's that it appeals to a broader audience in an easier way, I guess. People can relate more, I think, to mundane struggles. Okay, so how am I going to find out about this this cultist character, this high priest? I'm going to go to the library and search the name of his cult. Another person goes to the court and sees whether this high priest has got a criminal record. There's a whole part of this game that is all about the investigation. I think most people get that. There isn't a barrier to entry that's based on the innate misogyny that exists in a lot of tabletop role-playing games of old. And while that's been cleared up in a lot of cases, it still exists to a degree. Call of Cthulhu still has it. It's the 1920s. It's not like everyone is equal in the 1920s. People aren't equal now. But it never disadvantages you for playing something other than a big strapping man or hard-boiled private detective, which I think is good. You've got the book itself basically allows you to create characters from scratch and be whatever profession you want them to be, whether that's retired military, the hard-boiled private detective, a dilettante, so someone who's born into wealth and has no real skills other than a fat wallet. You could be an entertainer, you could be a doctor, you could be any profession that existed at the time, because your character is more important than the rank or their trade, I guess. It's more about them as a personality. And so, yeah, it's less rigid, I would say, than games like Dungeons and Dragons.
I would say you're definitely known for horror role-playing game when it comes to Vampire the Masquerade and Cult Divinity Lost. How is it you came into Call of Cthulhu?
So I came into Call of Cthulhu as a player. Probably one of the first role-playing games I ever played, as I participated in a campaign of the Shadows of Yog-Sothoth. Yog-Sothoth is one of the great old ones in Call of Cthulhu, and Shadows of Yog-Sothoth was one of the first published mega adventures for Call of Cthulhu, I believe. So it was a good entry point. It was crushingly difficult. I remember myself and the fellow players, we managed to get to the second chapter of the scenario, and it takes you to a village in Scotland where I think it's as simple as a little girl is missing, very Wicker Man. And you very quickly develop a sense of paranoia because it becomes apparent that many of the people that live in this Scottish village in the middle of the Highlands, cut off from everywhere, belong to a cult, the Order of the Silver Twilight. And they are not opposed to murder to basically defend themselves and protect their secrets. And further to that, they're protecting some serpent folk or lizard people from another dimension. They're living in the caves beneath the village. Now, you're up there ostensibly to look into the disappearance of this girl. Meanwhile, everyone who you're asking questions of in the village could be a cultist. And so the way you obtain information in Call of Cthulhu, if there isn't a handy library nearby, is usually to ask people questions, as it would be in real life. But I remember the sense of paranoia that the group felt. We ended up pretty much being convinced that the entire village were cultists. And it was only some years later that I bought the Shadows of Yog-Sothoth off myself, and it turns out only about 3 of them are. But the atmosphere was so pervasive that it hooked me, and it made all of the players think that, oh, you've gone away, Patrick. You're back. Wonderful. But yeah, the atmosphere was so pervasive that I just loved Call of Cthulhu from then on. And it's probably one of the role-playing games I ran the most. I think I've ran more Call of Cthulhu than I have Vampire the Masquerade. Yep, almost certainly. I think I find mysteries for Call of Cthulhu, cases for investigators to look into, far easier to come up with on the fly than Vampire. I think Call of Cthulhu is a perfect convention game because you just have one case to solve in the course of a 3 or 4 hour slot. And it took me a while to actually start writing Call of Cthulhu. But eventually let's think, how did I get into it? I think the first Call of Cthulhu writing that I did was for Cold War Cthulhu by Cubicle 7, because Call of Cthulhu as a license is open. It's basically the works of H.P. Lovecraft are public domain. So lots of companies have the right, can release games about Cthulhu and not worry about treading on toes, but Chaosium own certain aspects of it that they created, but are so synonymous with Call of Cthulhu now that I think people who are just entering into it assume that's still part of the public domain. Either way, I contributed to this Cold War Cthulhu game, which I was very fond of, which is set in the 1950s to 1980s. It's very much John le Carre, Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy, more than James Bond, and the idea of these Lovecraftian elements or Cthulhuid elements in the background manipulating the Cold War, or just happening to prey upon both Soviet and OSS agents and the like while the Cold War is raging. And yeah, I wrote a scenario for that I think the book was called Section 46, the operations manual, I believe, or it might have been Covert Actions. I don't know, it was a while back. But then I ended up writing for Chaosium, and I wrote one of their scenarios for their organized play, because just like Dungeons and Dragons has its Adventurers League and Pathfinder has the Society, Call of Cthulhu has an organized play. It's a little more low-key, but you can get these scenarios for free from their website if you sign up to their organized playlist. And the second one, I think, is mine. And that was a lot of fun. And from there, yeah, I ended up writing this whole damn source book by myself. So it was only recently that I really started getting into writing it, but I've enjoyed it a great deal. It's a change of pace from Vampire and the other games I work on.
How similar would you say it is to things like Cult? Or is it similar?
Well, that depends, I think, on the person running it, because most games of Call of Cthulhu I play and don't have as much, I guess, Gnostic horror, certainly. There's far fewer angels and devils in it. There's nothing so blatantly Gnostic or proto-Christian. And likewise, Call of Cthulhu, as, I guess, a book by Chaosium, doesn't delve too deeply into the idea of things like, There's quite a lot of sexual horror in Cult, as well as sort of gross out, gory horror. Cult has its subtleties as well, but I know I've worked on it. But I think Call of Cthulhu, oddly, considering that its main antagonists are gargantuan aliens from some forbidden part of the galaxy, is a lot more subtle. That there's a creeping tension in Call of Cthulhu that just builds and builds and builds until you conquer it, you run away from it, or you lose yourself to it. Whereas Cult has a kind of similar situation by its close, but the direction for getting there, the sort of road for getting there, is generally a lot more jagged and covered in thorns and sort of ripping you to shreds as you walk it.
Well, I think I would love to, if you ever take part of a Call of Cthulhu story with Redmond role playing like you did with the Summit for Cult. In fact, I even messaged you while I was listening to the Summit and just said, "Holy crap," because it was so intense. I truly was, and it's not often that I say this because I struggle with books on tape. My wife loves them. I struggle with them. I know there's fantastic stories being told that way, but when I listened to Cult, I was riveted. I was literally hanging on every word of both you and the players, and it was so well done. I would love to hear an actual play of Call of Cthulhu that you're running.
Oh, that is lovely of you to say, and I do think the Summit is up there as one of the best games that I've ran for Red Moon role playing. They really got it as players, and the audience that has listened to it really responded to it as well. So in terms of Call of Cthulhu, I may well do when this book I've worked on gets closer to release. And I'm sure Red Moon Role Playing would do a fantastic job with it. There's so many different assets of Call of Cthulhu as well, published by different companies. There's Trail of Cthulhu by Pelgrane Press. There's Delta Green. There's even Masks of the Mythos, which is coming up for Scion by Onyx Path Publishing.
Yeah.
So rather than just being the child of Zeus or Thor, you can now be a child of Cthulhu. See how that works out for you.
Isn't Chris Spivey working on that one as well?
Yeah, he's developing that one.
Yeah, because of course he did Harlem Unbound for Call of Cthulhu.
Yeah, and that is an incredibly well-regarded book, and rightfully so. It's amazingly well written, and provides an insight into I think, well, frankly, culture that has often been ignored by especially white audiences who are looking at the 1920s. So,
yeah, I just
Chris
got that book, and I'm really looking forward to reading through that book. We're actually hoping to get Chris on the show, so we'll be able to talk a lot more about that book. But speaking of books, of course, you've talked a little bit about this unnamed book that you've submitted to Chaosium. What exactly can you tell us?
Pretty much what I've just told you.
You're killing me.
So, no, I can tell you that it's about, and you shouldn't name him. You're not supposed to name him. I will name him because I'm only going to do it once, and I will perform a ritual.
Just don't do it 3 times.
That's generally the rule. Whoever came up with the 3-time rule, obviously, I think, the cultist that decided to tease an investigator and say it's all right to say Haster twice, just don't say it a 3rd time or you might get his attention, was just, I think, winding the investigator up, because in that occasion, Haster probably appeared after the 1st time and just devoured the investigator. Yeah, it's about Haster and the kinds of people that follow him, the kinds of adventures so there's going to be scenarios in it, there'll be lots of sample cults in it, there'll be new magic, new monsters, some investigators you can play straight off the bat, that kind of thing. It's a complete package. And Haster is one of the great old ones, and one of probably the most popular great old ones from a fan perspective. He has crossed over into lots of different media. Haster, or the King in Yellow, who is one of Haster's avatars or different consciousnesses, True Detective, as an example, season 1 of True Detective has the King in Yellow or the Yellow King and Carcosa appearing in it.
Right.
Well, especially close to the end. It's been a great pleasure to work on that, and it's just my luck. Of course, Robin D. Laws, fantastic author, released the Yellow King role-playing game for Pelgrane Press not that long ago. So hopefully the two books won't be held up next to each other, because there's no way mine will win against Robin's. But I think they both approach the subject matter from two very different vantages. And yeah, I think it's going to be a book that has a lot in it for a lot of different keepers and players. As one of the things I always strive for, no matter what book I'm writing or game I'm writing for, is it has to contain utility, things that people can use. It can't just be lots of lovely text that's fun to read, although that's nice as well. And I'm Oh, it sounds like we're just about to be strafed by a fighter plane. Sorry about that. And I'm quite happy. I'm quite happy with the content in my book. But yeah, I can't give away too much of what's in it,
It's
unfortunately.
unfortunate. That is unfortunate. Well, you know what? Okay, so we know it's about Hastur, the Yellow King, and that's
Twice we've said it now.
Yep, we need to stop. So let's talk about something you can talk about, and that's a soon-to-be project that's coming to Kickstarter from Onyx Path, being They Came from Beyond the Grave.
Yes.
Which
So
is
they came
the
from Beyond the
second
Grave.
in the They Came from series.
It is. Isn't that heartening when you've released one role-playing game and it's successful enough that you can do a second one?
Yeah.
Yeah. They Came from Beyond the Grave is a tabletop role-playing game based around the sort of 1970s Hammer horror, Amicus horror, Roger Corman stable of movies. And so it's all Christopher Lee's, Peter Cushing's, Ingrid Pitt's, Donald Pleasant's, that kind of thing. And it doesn't have the same level of farce as Beneath the Sea. It's still a humorous game. It's still a game you play for fun more than for deep introspection. And it's a game set across the 1970s and the 19th century. The supposition going into this game is that you will create two characters, or you will basically create one character who can be played in two different eras. Essentially, you're playing him or her or them here in the 1970s, and then you're playing their ancestor, someone who basically shares their traits in the 19th century. Because some of my favorite movies of the period are things like Tales from the Crypt, The House That Dripped Blood, all these stories that were portmanteaus where you had like 25-minute vignettes before you then went to the other inhabitant of the house and found out what horrible thing they'd done. And that is the shtick with They Came from Beyond the Grave. You will have your cast of characters that will generally go to somewhere terrible. It could be a creepy house on the side of a cliff. It could be to the cave complex where no one goes. It could be anything, really. And you will tell stories and go through adventures. There's more ham to it than farce, I would say. It still has the mechanics that were very popular in Beneath the Sea, things like cinematics and quips. It doesn't really take anything away. In fact, it is built to be additional to Sea. So it contains all of the core rules, but if you want both games and you want to cross them over, you can very easily do that, as very few of the cinematics are repeated. None of the archetypes are repeated. They're all completely different character classes, if you will, and all of the quips are different. So essentially, you can put them together and make one very big game that covers both science fiction and horror. So yeah, it's something a lot of people are looking forward to, it seems. Anecdotally, anyway, I think more people are excited about Beyond the Grave than were about Beneath the Sea, so that's nice. And I ran it at the Onyx Path Con, which we had a few weeks ago at time of recording, and it went down spectacularly well, with all credit to B. Dave Waters of LA by Night, because he participated in that as a smooth PI from the 1970s. Dolomite Shaft kind of character, and he was absolutely amazing in it. He really captured that 1970s vibe.
I can see B Dave doing that. He does some great work.
Oh yeah. He's excellent. I'm working with him on Werewolf the Apocalypse 5th edition.
Yes, that's right. I forgot that he was on that. That's another game that I know that we're going to be looking into very soon because we're going to be doing a whole month of Werewolf very soon. But that's besides the point. So when is this Kickstarter launching? Or do you know?
Should be in the next couple of weeks. So look for it around mid-July. I think we have all of the art assets we're waiting for, and so that basically just means we need to get the Kickstarter set up and approved by Kickstarter. So that's nice. We're hoping to have a trailer movie like we did for Beneath the Sea, which was constructed by Larry Blameyer, who directed movies like Trail of the Screaming Forehead and Lost Skeleton of Cadavra. He is interested in doing a Beyond the Grave trailer as well, so hopefully that will come to light. And I think we'll have a Red Moon role-playing actual play as well. At the very least, we'll have a couple of things to promote it as it's going on. But yeah, I'm looking forward to this because a lot of my time writing is spent working on horror games that are pretty damn miserable, and I love it. I cannot complain because this is the life I have chosen, and I'm very fortunate to be able to be creative for a living. But it can be grinding when you are working on nothing but, I guess, stark horror all the time. And so Beyond the Grave has a technicolor attitude toward horror. It feels like the 1970s, where there's a lot of over-the-top acting, a lot of unnecessary screaming, the occasional heaving bosom, and the ridiculous amount of glowing reddish, orangish blood on the screen because people are celebrating that they can record things in glorious Technicolor now.
That's excellent. And of course, fans of They Came From Beneath the or Beyond the They Came From Beneath the Sea. Sorry, getting confused of my They Came From games. Those who backed the Kickstarter anyway should have found out that I know they've. I mean, your time to get your information is just about done because that book's about to ship.
Yeah, I mean, it's taken longer than we would have hoped because of the pandemic. I mean, It's hardly the worst thing to come out of the pandemic, but it did disrupt the shipping of and publication of They Came From Beneath the Sea, unfortunately. But thankfully, things seem to be rolling along now for some reason, so I'm not questioning it. If the books are prepared to go out to people, then that's good news as far as I'm concerned. But of course, listeners, do feel free, if needs be, to keep it in your porch for a week before you open the package. I would hate to find out that someone contracted COVID from They Came From Beneath the Sea. My role-playing game killed people. So do as you will. Spray it if you like, before and after use.
Stay safe, please. Don't let Matthew's game kill you. Let it kill you with laughter or in the horror aspect, but not because of COVID.
Yeah. That's the attitude, I think.
So obviously, They Came From Beyond the Grave is again, as you mentioned with Roger Corman, is pulling from the your love of cinema, and we've talked about that before. What are some of the movies that really influenced you with this game?
So, gosh, there's so many because in a way, the best Dracula movies, best Hammer Dracula movies, are the ones that released in the decade before the one this is set in, because I don't want this to be a game about really high quality horror. I want this to be about Dracula AD 1974 or however it's written, which has Dracula with sideburns. And still Christopher Lee. Essentially, it's the movies where Christopher Lee is looking increasingly tired of playing this bloody count. But Peter Cushing is always game for a staking. He's always up for it. I think there are really good movies from the 70s that I love. Like one that I always recommend is Asylum. Asylum is a movie by Amicus. Amicus were much like Hammer, a movie studio. Well, Hammer still exists. I don't know if Amicus does, but a movie studio that excelled in making portmanteau movies. So portmanteaus, as I mentioned, are stories or movies that contain multiple short stories. And the Tales from the Crypt movies and the Twilight Zone movie later on are sort of synonymous with. Asylum has a character, a new doctor, going to an asylum and essentially being told, you will get the job at the asylum if you can diagnose each of the patients, or something to that effect. And so he travels from patient to patient, like 4 of them during the course of the film. And as he visits each of them, they tell him their story, and then you see that story play out. And these patients include, I'm trying to remember some of the actors in it now. You have the chap from A Clockwork Orange who is fantastic for his intense stares. He is the author in A Clockwork Orange. And Patrick McGee, I think. And among various others, Peter Cushing appears in this movie as well. And it's a movie where you can kind of see the end coming from a mile off, because eventually, spoilers, it was released in the 1970s, it turns out that the person showing the new doctor around is in fact one of the patients who has escaped. And he murders him. The movie ends. But it's such a fantastic little film of short horror stories. I completely love it. It's one of my favorites. I watch it again and again. And it really influenced me for this game, because it has this and Tales from the Crypt, the original Tales from the Crypt movie, have ridiculous deaths, ridiculous stories, ridiculous plots, but the actors are trying to portray them all so damn earnest. They're acting them out as if this is going to be the thing that shoots them into the limelight. Tales from the Crypt has got a wonderful scene where a escaped patient from an asylum is dressed as Father Christmas or Santa Claus and breaks into Joan Collins's house and strangles her to death from behind with his hands on her shoulders. He sort of gives her a very vigorous neck and shoulder massage, and her head is just lolling about like she's being strangled. It's bizarre. It's not nonsense, but it's played so honest. And I had the same feeling with Beneath the Sea. I love the B movies of the 1950s where the actors truly think this is going to be the next big science fiction. Ed Wood is, of course, a very good example of this with movies like Plan 9 from Outer Space. And I think you get that a lot with 1970s horror. Now, of course, there are fantastic 1970s horror movies as well. Some of the best horror movies are from the 1970s. It was a real revolutionary decade for horror. So we've got monsters in the game, everything from Dracula and the Brides of Dracula to the Stalking Killer to the devil himself, spelt in all caps whenever it appears in the book, and cultists and such like. So you can play any aspect of this horror genre, really. But yeah, I think it's trying to think of any other movies I put in such a long list of sort of inspirational media and Beyond the Grave, that when people see it, I don't want them to just read through it and think, oh, that's interesting. I want them to check out some of these films. Some of them you can watch for free, probably illegally, on YouTube, and it's worth checking them out because they will really inspire you as to how to run or play this game.
That's actually my next question is, where can we find some of these films? Because I know some of them, well, the majority of them are probably not on streaming services like Netflix.
Well, no. I think some of them might be on Shudder, which is another streaming service. I regrettably don't have Shudder. I should, because I love horror. But let's see. You could probably get DVDs of a lot of them. I doubt you're ever going to get a Criterion collection for most of these, but you can probably get DVDs, maybe the occasional Blu-ray. YouTube does have a lot of this material online for free, and whether that I don't think they've entered the public domain. But I think so many of them
Yeah.
aren't making money in any other means that no one really cares, and that's a horrible thing to think about anything really, because I'm not a fan of piracy. And yet, if there is no other way to access these movies, literally no other way, then I say at least, if you if you watch it and like it, then at least consider picking up a copy of another movie by the same studio. But yeah, I recommend. Let's see. I've actually got my draft here, and I've got a whole load of this inspirational media. I'm just trying to think. We've got some of them. Yeah, Blood from the Mummy's Tomb, which I'm pretty certain is on YouTube as well. The Blood on Satan's Claw is actually a really serious horror movie of the 1970s. It has the feel of the Wicker Man or the Witchfinder General. Everything is really grimy and seedy, and again, there's lots of screaming, lots of violence in it. The House That Dripped Blood, I mentioned earlier. You have everyone from Christopher Lee, Peter Cushing, of course. You can't move without bumping into one of them in all of these movies.
Right.
And yeah, it was Dracula AD 1972, which not 1974, AD 1972, which was released unsurprisingly in 1972.
It looks like I'm on my Amazon Prime account where I found Asylum, where you can stream it for free. It looks like Amazon has a lot of these through Prime Video. So if you do have that
wonderful.
streaming service, you can watch a lot of these shows for free.
Well, I think most people do have Prime now, so that's a good shout. And I would say, in fact, I'm surprised I forgot about it. Amazon Prime has an amazing collection of terrible movies.
Yes, they do.
Netflix is interesting, just as an aside, because it gives the impression of having a very sort of curated list. A small selection that's changed up occasionally. But it's got this weird thing where if you actually search by category, and the categories aren't labeled, you can't find them anywhere. You've got to look for them online, and if you type the category in, you can find a whole other raft of movies that aren't accessible via the main page. It's weird. And
Right.
Amazon Prime just kind of puts everything on display. It's like Netflix has a hidden room behind the curtain of the shop where, if you want the weird stuff, you've got to ask for it. Whereas Amazon Prime, it's all in the shop window. So you've got a movie as excellent as Interstellar next to, let's see, The Beast Must Die, which, by the way, The Beast Must Die is an excellent werewolf movie. And rarely for a movie in the 1970s with a predominantly white cast, the lead actor is a black man, and very smooth and charming with it. He's trying to remember the actor's name. Calvin Lockhart. That was it, Calvin Lockhart. And God, he is amazing. We've based the art of our hunter archetype in They Came From Beyond the Grave on Calvin Lockhart because he is that damn cool.
Gotcha. So you have a lot of stuff you're working on right now, Matthew.
Oh, always. Yes, I never stop working. You can't really afford to you don't get paid much in this kind of industry anyway, but can't afford to, partly for the risk of competition in sort of opening the door to the dark and deep secrets of the RPG industry, gaming in general. There are so many people that want to get into it that when you get into it, you kind of need to cling on to it with your fingertips and keep working to make sure people know that you're reliable and good. So I don't just keep working out of fear, though. I am on a long-term contract with Onyx Path, so that's good. I'm still working on lots of Vampire the Masquerade products, both role-playing games, board games, video games as well. So adding new arrows to my quiver every single day, it seems, with vampire. That's and I say that it's a hardship to work on such stark horror, but I love vampire, and I'm so grateful that so many people sort of associate me with that brand. It's lovely to know.
Kind of hard not to.
Yeah, I've kind of made an impression, good or bad, on Vampire the Masquerade at this point, and you're just going to be stuck with me for a while. People might try to get me fired, but no one's succeeded yet.
Let's hope it continues with that trend, because you're doing some excellent work, including, I just realized looking at your website that you worked on the new board game Swansong for Vampire the Masquerade.
Oh no, Swansong is the video game.
Oh, is that the video game? Okay,
yeah.
I'm getting confused because there's been so many new Vampire the Masquerade, either video or board games that came out. For some reason, I was thinking this was the card game. Which one?
No, so the board games that I've worked on for Vampire the Masquerade are Heritage, which is the centuries-spanning one. Chapters, which is the one set in Montreal. There is a trailer for Chapters, which is out. The trailer was written by myself, so if you enjoy it, tell me. It's always nice to know. And Blood Feud as well. I contributed quite a lot to that one as well. In terms of the video games, one I can't even name, not allowed, but Swansong, I have done some writing for that, and will hopefully be doing more writing in the future. So yeah, I am branching out from the tabletop RPGs, but it is where my heart lies, and I'm sure where I will always go back to.
Like I said, I got myself confused as to which one's which, because there's been a lot of products announced for this. Heritage is one that I think I learned about that one a few years ago, and I was so sad that when that one came to Kickstarter, I was not able to back it. And then I find out, I think it was 4 months ago, that my younger brother, him and I were visiting, and he says, "Oh, by the way, I backed that game Heritage on Kickstarter."
Well, that one's due to be fulfilled quite soon. I think people are going to start receiving their copies.
That's going to be exciting, because him and I are both really looking forward to playing that one. So,
well, I'm glad to hear it.
Well, Matthew, it's always a pleasure to have you on our show. I love it so much when you can come in and talk to us about Vampire or any of the other stuff that you're working on. I know that you just were part of a very successful cult Kickstarter.
Yes. God, yeah, I am busy, aren't I? I am always living in fear that I'm going to forget something that I'm working on. This is what spreadsheets were built for, and I'm so bad at maintaining mine. Yes, I contributed a scenario to the recent cult Kickstarter, the scenario book, which I think is called Screams and Whispers. I didn't develop the book, so I didn't come up with the overall title, but I came up with a scenario called "It Started and Ended with Screams," and I'm not trying to toot my own horn or try to sound edgy, but if you thought The Summit was horrible, this one is worse.
Oh my gosh!
Part of me wonders if this is the thing that's going to sink me in the industry. But the thing is, with It Started and Ended with Screams, which is set in a center for troubled youths.
Oh, geez.
It's definitely a very troubling scenario, and it's deliberately so. And I have placed throughout it warnings and guidelines that, absolutely do not run this for your average tabletop group. Everyone needs to sign on for this. Everyone needs to be aware of what this scenario can contain, and any of it can be stripped out, minus the core plot. And the core plot isn't actually terribly shocking. It's everything that's going on around it. But it's a scenario that handles some pretty heavy subject material. Some of it I am, I guess, intimately aware of. other parts of it I've researched or gained consultation on. I've been very careful with it, but I have no doubt that it will not be for every single group, and that's fine. I don't want my games to be for every single group. I said in an interview recently, and I maintain this, when someone comes up to me about the summit or emails me about the summit and says, I didn't think much of that, I'm fine with that. I really don't mind if people don't like my work. I see myself like, I guess, any other creative individual. The Beatles, I don't see myself as the Beatles, but the Beatles had lots of songs. Some people absolutely love Me Do, and She Loves You, and Please Please Me, and can't stand Helter Skelter.
Right.
But that doesn't mean that the Beatles are a shit band. And likewise, some people might really like my vampire work, but not like my cult work. Some people might really like the cult work, but may have no taste for Call of Cthulhu, or Mummy the Curse, or Contagion Chronicle, or any of the other games I've worked on. So I'm quite comfortable with that. But I do think this one is going to be probably the most divisive piece of work that I've seen published. So I'll look forward to seeing the reactions.
You ever sit back when you finish writing something, sit back and go, wow, Matthew, that was really fucked up?
Yeah, this some of the flaws in the summit as well. I mean, the gestation for the summit occurs in Beckett's Jihad Diary. There's for Vampire the Masquerade. There's a chapter in that where I have a Bali infested
Yes.
high rise.
I thought there were similarities between those two. Okay, that makes sense.
And well, I mean, it's all set off by J.G. Ballard, of course, and High Rise, the novel and the movie. But I like contained horror, not because it prevents people from running away, although that certainly plays a part, but because with something like a tower block, you know that with every level you ascend, it's going to get worse and worse, but you feel compelled to do it because you're curious, because you're human, and because there might actually be something for you at the top. You might find something out about yourself, you might get the big reward, whatever. And I remember when I was writing Summits, there were certainly parts of it that I cut. There were flaws. I thought, you know what, let's not do this. It's too vulgar, too coarse. And I don't regret doing that, removing them. There's still material in there that's vulgar, but it's deliberately vulgar. It's deliberately there to make people think, oh, this is disgusting, not make the players feel nauseous. I've no desire to bring about physical revulsion from the players. Have it from your characters, definitely. I like for there to be a certain level of remove between player and character thought.
I know that like I said, when I listened to the summit, everything about that story, everything about the way you told it, the way the players played it, made me buy the game Cult. I'd always been intrigued by it, but I just could never pull the trigger until I listened to that, and I was like, I have to own this game. But I know in my heart that this is never a game that I can bring to my table.
Yeah, and I think that is a perfectly reasonable thing to decide on. Because not every single gaming group likes every single type of game, and just the same as not everyone goes to the cinema to watch The Devil's Rejects by Rob Zombie. Not every single person goes to see a romantic comedy starring Julia Roberts or whoever else. Different audiences like different things, and providing it isn't just... So I guess I have a bit of a line, a bit of a boundary. I don't like to put in things like sexual violence or racism, or I don't like to punch down with my material for the sake of punching down. I think it's an easy thing to do to generate shock, and shock isn't really what I want out of my material, whether it's fiction, whether it's gaming material, or what have you. So I'm not going to have someone with a disability being abused for having a disability, as an example.
Sure.
But at the same time, I know that the Summit has some material in it that is absolutely repulsive. So, yeah, I guess I'm being a bit rambly, but I do think that it's absolutely fine for gaming groups to say, you know what, we don't fancy this. The very first gaming group I was ever a part of said, we don't want to play Vampire the Masquerade. It sounds too bleak. And so the first group I played with, well, I never played Vampire with. I didn't play Vampire until about like the 4th year of getting into role playing. When I was at a new table at the same club. And even then, it was only Dark Ages because they hated contemporary setting. They wanted the sort of the great swinging swords and marching into the dark between the sort of flickering lights of distant towns. So yeah, it's a shame in a way that you will never get to experience cult, but that's what online gaming is for. Find the right group for you.
And that's something I'm going to, once my schedule settles down, that I will be working towards, because I want to experience the game, because I think it's a beautiful game. It's beautifully dark. I say this about Wraith as well, Wraith the Oblivion, because I think Wraith is a beautifully depressing and dark game. I've tried playing Wraith, and it's one of those games that I love the game, but it's really difficult to play. And I think Colt is going to be like that, and it's got to be with the right group.
Mm.
So I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah, well, I do hope you. I don't know. I completely agree. I think Cult is a beautiful game. If nothing else, from an aesthetic perspective, it is just wondrous. Every single page is a fantastic book to just look at. And yeah, I hope you do get a lot of dark and sinister fun out of it.
So do I. Well, Matthew, that is all the time that we have. Again, I thank you so much for coming on the show. It is always a pleasure to have you on. I look forward to many more times where we can talk. And then perhaps maybe one day when the world settles down, I can meet you at a convention and actually have you sign one of my books.
Oh, maybe. Well, if we ever start flying to and from America again, maybe.
We'll see. So thanks again, Matthew.
My pleasure.